My name is Simone Echebi, and I am 32 years old. 5 years ago, on a Saturday in May, I walked across the stage at the University of Michigan's Rackham Graduate School commencement and received my master's degree in public health in front of an auditorium of 1,400 people, none of whom were my family. I had reserved 6 seats in the third row. I had mailed the ticket confirmation 3 weeks before the ceremony. I had followed up twice by phone and once by text. 6 seats, third row, empty at 10:15 when the processional began, empty when my row was called, empty when my name was announced, empty when I crossed the stage and shook the dean's hand and turned toward the photographer. And that is when I saw her. My cousin Adana was sitting in seat 4 of the third row, staring back at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, which was the expression of someone who has just understood something they did not know they were about to understand. Adana was at the University of Michigan that day for a different ceremony in a different auditorium. She had gotten lost. She had walked through the wrong door. She had sat down in the wrong row and found herself looking at me crossing a stage at the exact moment my family was somewhere else entirely, and the photograph the university photographer took at that moment was a photograph that Adana shared to her. Instagram story that afternoon with the caption "Wrong Auditorium, Right Moment," and that was reshared 47 times in the first 12 hours. Before I tell you what happened when my family saw the photograph, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I love knowing where you are. Now let me take you back 11 years, to a kitchen in Lagos, Nigeria, and explain how a person gets to be 32 years old with children who do not know what their mother has spent her life building. I mean, with a family that does not know. I will start again. Let me take you back 11 years and explain what kind of family produces a daughter who reserves 6 seats and fills 0 of them. My family's relationship to achievement is organized around a specific and well-mapped hierarchy that has been in place for long enough that everyone inside it has stopped examining it and simply operates within its terms. The hierarchy is based on 3 variables: the perceived prestige of the institution attended, the perceived prestige of the profession chosen, and the degree to which the achievement can be described in 10 seconds at a family gathering without requiring elaboration. My uncle Chukwudi is a cardiologist at a hospital in Lagos that everyone in the family can name. His son, my cousin Emeka, is a software engineer at a company whose name is globally recognizable. His daughter, my cousin Adana, was at the time of my graduation finishing a law degree at a Michigan law school, which placed her near the top of the hierarchy, in the category of achievements that produce recognition rather than questions. I was finishing a master's degree in public health, which is a field that produces neither the clean legibility of medicine nor the recognizable name of a technology company, and which I had chosen because I had understood since I was 19 that the infrastructure of population health was the most consequential and least celebrated domain available to someone with my particular combination of skills and interests. My family had received this choice when I announced it with the specific warmth of people who were trying to be supportive and who were finding the effort required. My mother, whose name is Ngozi, came to the United States from Lagos in 1989, the same year I was born, and has spent 33 years building a life in the specific way of people who arrive somewhere with the full understanding that nothing is owed and everything must be constructed, which produced in her a quality of practical endurance that I admire, without reservation. It also produced a specific orientation toward achievement that equates its visibility with its value, meaning she has always been more comfortable with my successes when they came with a credential that other people recognized on first hearing. She is a good mother. I want to be precise about this because the story requires it. She was at every school play, every neighborhood event, every recital that fit the category of things mothers attend. She also developed, over the years, a pattern of attending the events of my cousin Adana's life with a slightly fuller presence than she attended mine, which I want to name accurately rather than dramatically. It was not that she chose Adana over me in any explicit or considered way. It was that Adana's achievements arrived with clearer signage, and my mother was more confident navigating toward the signage she could read. Adana's graduation from law school was the anchor event of the May weekend. My graduation was the afterthought. This is the structure of what happened, and the structure is what produced the 6 empty seats. My father, whose name is Emmanuel, is a civil engineer who works for a firm in Detroit and has spent his professional life building infrastructure that most people use without knowing. It exists. He is a man who loves me in the way of fathers, who express love through provision and through the general orientation of their attention toward you without often saying so, and he has the same pattern as my mother with respect to legibility, meaning that Adana's achievements were more immediately describable to him than mine, and that he organized his engagement accordingly. The Friday before my Saturday was Adana's law school graduation ceremony. My family drove 8 hours from Detroit to Ann Arbor, attended Adana's Friday ceremony, had a catered dinner, and stayed at the same hotel. They were 11 hours from my Saturday when they received a call on Friday evening from my mother's sister in Lagos about something I was never told the full details of, and after 40 minutes on the phone, my father told me they were going to need to drive back to Detroit because there was a family situation that required attention. My mother said she was sorry. She said it with the genuine feeling of someone who was sorry and who had also made a decision, and the decision was final, and the sorry did not change it. I said I understood. I drove to the auditorium alone in my academic regalia with 6 tickets in my pocket and the May morning light coming through the Michigan trees, and I found the 3rd row, and I counted the empty seats, and I sat with my cohort and I waited for the processional to begin. I want to tell you something about the hour and 40 minutes I sat in that auditorium before my row was called, because it was not what you might expect. I did not spend it in grief. I had done my grief in the car on the drive from my apartment, which had taken 11 minutes, which was the amount of time available for grief before I needed to arrive composed and remain composed. What I spent the hour and 40 minutes doing was watching. I watched the ceremony the way I watch everything in my professional life, which is with the specific and sustained attention of someone who is in the room to understand what is happening, rather than to perform a response to it. I watched the department presentations and the individual name calls and the way the auditorium section containing each graduate's family lit up when the name was announced, the phones rising, the faces turning, the specific wave of warmth that moved through the room each time a person crossed the stage and another person in the room was happy for them. I watched this without performing an emotion about it, because I am a public health epidemiologist by training and by temperament, and I watch things. I noted what I saw. I sat with what I noted. And when my row was called and I stood and processed toward the stage stairs, I was thinking about the 6 empty seats in the specific analytic way that I think about absence when absence is data, which is that I was noting the pattern that the empty seats confirmed rather than the injury of the moment itself, and the pattern had been building for long enough that the confirmation felt more like information than wound. Then my name was called, and I walked across the stage and I shook the dean's hand and I turned toward the photographer and I looked out, and Adana was in seat 4 of the 3rd row looking back at me, and the analysis stopped. Adana had come in through the wrong door because the 2 auditoriums were in adjacent buildings with similar entryways, and she had been looking for a different ceremony and had walked through the wrong door and followed the usher to the available seats in the 3rd row and had sat down and had not looked at the reserved card until she was already seated, at which point she was looking at the reserved card and also looking at me crossing the stage, and the 2 pieces of information arrived simultaneously. The university photographer took the photograph. It shows me at center stage with my diploma in one hand and my other hand raised in acknowledgement of the audience, and Adana in the third row with the laminated reserved card visible in her lap and the 5 empty seats on either side of her, and an expression that the photographer captured without understanding what it meant, and that I have looked at many times since in the print on my desk. She posted it that afternoon. Wrong auditorium, right moment. 47 reshares in 12 hours. I found her in the lobby after the ceremony. She was standing near the exit with the reserved card still in her hand, looking at it and then at the crowd. She saw me before I reached her. She said Simone. I said Adana. She said I walked into the wrong ceremony. I said I know. She said I saw the reserved tickets on the seats after I sat down. She held up the card. I said you can keep it. She looked at me for a moment and then she said that everyone. I said Detroit. She looked at the card. She looked at the empty lobby where families were still moving in clusters, and she said, I am sorry, Simone. She said it in the personal way, meaning she was sorry for her part of it, which was that she had been the anchor event of the weekend, and had known it, and had not done anything about it, which was a form of complicity in the structure, even if it was not an active choice. I received the apology in the personal way it was offered, meaning I accepted it as something real that had cost her something to say, and that did not require me to make it easier for her. I said thank you. I said I was glad she had walked through the wrong door. She almost laughed and I almost laughed, and neither of us fully laughed, but we stood in the lobby together in the way that two people stand together when they have just been in the same significant moment by different paths and are still figuring out what the moment means. And after a few minutes, we walked out into the May morning together. And that was enough for that day. I want to stop here because I need to ask you something. Have you ever had a day that was supposed to be witnessed and wasn't? And have you ever had someone show up for it by accident who had never shown up for it on purpose? And have you ever understood something in that moment about the difference between intention and presence that you had not understood before? Tell me in the comments. I read every word. And please subscribe now if you have not already, because what happened in the weeks after the photograph went out, and what my mother said when she called 2 days later, and what Adana and I have built in the 5 years since is the part I have been holding back. And the holding back is over. My mother called on the Monday, 2 days after the ceremony. I had been expecting the call the way you expect whether you have been watching Gather, not the exact shape of it, but the arrival. She had seen the photograph through the family group chat, where Adana's post had been reshared by multiple people, including 2 of my uncles and my grandmother in Lagos, who uses her smartphone with the focused determination of an 81-year-old, who has decided that the world will adapt to her rather than the reverse. The photograph had done something in the family's information network that I had not anticipated, which was that it had made the empty seats visible to everyone simultaneously rather than privately, meaning 47 sets of people had seen the third row with its reserved cards and its 1 occupant, and its 5 unoccupied places, and the visual information was immediate and complete, in a way that a phone call or a story told afterward would not have been, because a photograph does not require interpretation the way a description does, and does not allow for the modifications that the telling introduces. The empty seats were there. The reserved cards were there. Adana's expression was there. Everyone could see what they were looking at. My mother said my name, and then she said she had seen the photograph. I said I knew. She said the seats were empty. I said yes. She said there were 6 of them. I said I had reserved 6. A pause of 5 seconds, which I counted. And then she said it had been the wrong decision to leave. She said it plainly, in the voice of a woman who has reached a conclusion she did not want to reach, and is saying it anyway. I said I agreed. She said she should have been there. I said yes. She said she was sorry. I said I knew. We were on the phone for 38 minutes. She asked me to tell her about the day, which I had not been asked before, and I told her. I told her about the processional and the room and the names being called and the hour and 40 minutes of watching and what it had felt like to look up and find Adana in the third row. My mother was quiet through most of this in the way that she is quiet when she is listening rather than waiting for her turn to speak, which is a different quality of silence, and I have learned to distinguish between them. When I finished, she said she was proud of me, not for the ceremony, though that too, but for the degree and what it represented, and she asked me to explain what I was going to do with it, which was the question nobody had asked me before, and which I answered for 15 minutes while she asked follow-up questions that came from what I said rather than from an agenda she had prepared in advance. My father called that evening. He said less, which is his pattern, but what he said was specific. He said he had not prioritized correctly, and that he was going to do better. He said it in the voice he uses when he is making a commitment rather than offering a sentiment, and I accepted it as what it was, which is a commitment from an engineer, meaning it was load-bearing rather than decorative. He asked about my work, which by then was the beginning of a public health fellowship at a community health organization in Detroit, and I told him about it for 20 minutes, and he asked 3 follow-up questions and said he would like to come see the organization. He came in September. He walked through the building with the focused attention of a man assessing a structure and said at the end of the visit that it was doing important work, not impressive. Important. I wrote that down when I got home. I want to say something about the degree itself before I continue, because I have described it primarily as a credential, and it was also an education, and the education deserves more than the summary I have given it. The Master of Public Health from the University of Michigan School of Public Health is a 2-year degree that I completed with a concentration in epidemiology and a focus on health disparities in urban populations. My thesis analyzed patterns of delayed healthcare-seeking behavior in a specific immigrant population in southeastern Michigan and identified 3 structural factors contributing to the delay. It was subsequently used by a community organization in Detroit to redesign their patient intake process in a way that increased same-day appointments for that population by 31%. 31%. The number means that people who were waiting too long began receiving care sooner. It means some of those people received diagnoses earlier than they would have otherwise. It means some of them are alive, who would not be alive under the previous intake design. This work does not produce a credential that fits in 10 seconds at a family gathering. It produces health outcomes that can be measured in disease rates and vaccination uptake and early detection percentages, and the specific and uncelebrated reduction in preventable death that happens when a population has access to consistent and competent primary care. I am telling you this because the degree my family missed was not an occasion. It was the conclusion of 2 years of this kind of work. And the work is what the day was actually marking. And they did not know that because they had not been paying attention to the work, and not paying attention to the work was the actual cost of the empty seats, which was not the ceremony but the understanding of what the ceremony was for. Before I tell you what happened in the months that followed, and what Adana and I have become to each other in 5 years, and what my grandmother said in the letter she sent me through my mother. In December, I want to stop here. If you have spent years doing work that the people closest to you have not fully understood, not because they are incapable of understanding it, but because they have been looking at the credential rather than the work, tell me about that in the comments. Tell me what the work actually is. Subscribe now if you have not already, because the next part is the part I most want you to hear, which is that the photograph did something I did not plan, and that the people who were not in the auditorium ended up understanding more about what I had been building than they had in the 5 years before it. Adana is a person I have known my whole life and with whom I had, for most of that life, the specific distance of 2 people who have been positioned as competitors within a family system without ever having agreed to the competition. We had grown up at parallel distances, achieving in parallel categories, being compared in conversations that neither of us initiated, and had developed the polite and somewhat formal relationship of people who understand each other's position in a structure without having much else between them. The photograph changed that, or began to change it, which is different from the photograph resolving it. Adana posted it without consulting me, which was the right decision, and which I told her so when she called to ask if I had seen it, which she called approximately 3 minutes after posting, and I said I had already seen it, and that it was exactly what the moment had been, and that I was glad she had posted it. She said she had felt she had to. I said I understood. She said she had been sitting with it since the lobby and had been thinking about the family and the weekend, and what her presence in the room had meant to her, and that she was not sure she had been fair to me over the years, not in the active way of doing something harmful, but in the passive way of accepting a system without examining what the system was doing to the people inside it. I said I thought that was an accurate description of what had happened, and that passive acceptance of an unfair system was its own kind of choice, and that I appreciated her naming it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she wanted to know what I actually did, meaning she wanted me to explain the work in the way I would explain it to someone who was genuinely trying to understand it, rather than trying to find the 10-second version. I spent 35 minutes explaining public health epidemiology to a law student who listened with the focused attention of someone doing intake for a case. At the end, she said she thought it was remarkable, not impressive. Remarkable, which is the word that means worth remarking, worth noting, worth keeping in the record. I sat with the word for a long time after she said it. Over the 5 years since the ceremony, Adana and I have built a working relationship that neither of us had planned, and that has been, in terms of actual utility, more valuable than most professional relationships I have had. She is in her 2nd year of practicing immigration law in Chicago. She calls me when she has a public health question relevant to her clients, which is more often than you might expect, because immigration and public health intersect at almost every point where the healthcare system meets a population that has reason to be cautious about institutional contact. I call her when I need someone who thinks in systems and structures and who can help me understand the legal architecture underlying something my work is running up against. We have had dinner 6 times in 5 years, which is more dinners than we had in the preceding 27 combined. We are building something that was not previously available to build because neither of us was in a position to start building it inside the families. Comparative framework. The wrong door was what removed us from that framework long enough to find out what was actually there between us. My grandmother, Obiageli, is 81 years old and lives in Lagos in the same house where my mother grew up, and she sent me a letter in December of 2019. 7 months after the ceremony, through my mother, who handed it to me when I was visiting for Christmas, without explanation or comment. My grandmother had written it in Igbo, and my mother had written a translation on a separate sheet of paper, and the translation said that my grandmother had watched me growing up through the reports that traveled back to Lagos, and that she had known from those reports that I had chosen a different kind of path than the paths family celebrated, and that she had been watching to see whether I would stay on it or whether the family's gravity would pull me toward the more legible option. She said she had been glad to see that I had stayed on it. She said the photograph had reached Lagos and that she had looked at it for a long time, and that what she had seen in it was not the empty seats but the stage and the person on the stage, and the expression of the cousin who had walked through the wrong door and found herself in the presence of something real. She said she thought the wrong door had been right all along. She said she had always believed in me, not because I was the most credentialed member of the family, but because I was the one who had chosen the work that was harder to explain, and that choosing the harder to explain work was the best evidence she knew of a person who was doing the work for the work's sake rather than for the recognition. The letter is in the frame on my desk, behind the photograph, in the same configuration that Vera Stillman kept Daniel's note behind the provenance document, which is to say, in the place that is not immediately visible but that I know how to find. My fellowship became a full-time position in March of 2020, which was the month the city began shutting down, for reasons that were professionally the most significant thing that had happened to public health in my lifetime, and personally the strangest context in which to begin a permanent role. I became the epidemiology lead for a network of community health clinics, serving approximately 42,000 patients across southeastern Michigan over the course of the following 2 years, a position that required the specific combination of skills I had been building since I was 19, and that was, in terms of the work it required and the outcomes it produced, the most directly useful thing I had ever done. I will not describe those 2 years in full, because they belong to a different kind of story. I will say that the work was what it was, and that it mattered in the ways that the work of public health matters, which is measurably and silently, and without the recognition that more legible professions receive, and that I was glad every day to be the person doing it. My mother visited the clinic network in the fall of 2021. She had been asking about coming since the September 2019 visit with my father, and the pandemic had delayed it. And when she came, she brought my Aunt Chidinma, who is her sister, and who has spent 40 years as a nurse in Lagos and who understood what she was looking at in a way that my mother was still learning. My aunt spent 3 hours asking questions that were more technically specific than anything. My mother had asked, and by the end of the visit my aunt had met my supervisor and had exchanged information with her about a comparable initiative in Lagos that she was involved with, and the connection has produced 2 Zoom calls and an ongoing conversation about shared methodology that continues. My mother watched all of this, and at the end of the visit she said she was sorry it had taken her this long to come. I said the door had always been open. She said she knew, and that the knowing without the coming was the part she was sorry about. I said I accepted the apology. I meant it. What I understand now, 5 years after the ceremony, and 4 years into the work, and 3 years after my grandmother's letter, and 2 years after my mother's visit, and 1 year after my father's second visit, and the ongoing monthly calls with Adana about cases where public health and immigration law intersect, is that the photograph did something I had not been able to do in the years before it, which was to make the gap visible to the people who had been producing it. I had tried to make the gap visible through explanation and through invitation and through the standard means that people use when they want the people who love them to understand something, and none of those means had worked as well as a single photograph of an empty third row. I am not going to describe this as justice. Justice is the wrong word for the feeling of something that should not have needed a photograph to make it visible finally becoming visible through one. I am going to describe it as information, which is what it was. And information is the thing that public health runs on. And I understand information in its capacity to change behavior when it reaches the right person in the right form at the right time, and the photograph was the right form of the right information at a time when 47 sets of people were ready to receive it. That is how things change. Not through argument or accusation or the accumulation of grievances, but through a single accurate image arriving at the moment when the people looking at it are finally ready to see what it shows. The photograph is on my desk, the graduation print, the stage photograph, in a frame that my grandmother sent me through my mother in December of 2019, along with the letter. Adana posted it with a caption, and I have never reposted it. It does not need to be anywhere else. It is there when I need to see it, and most days I do not need to see it, and most days I do not. The work is what I come back to. When I need something to look at, not the photograph but the numbers, the 31% and the 42,000, and the disease rates that run in the other direction from what they were running before the interventions. And those numbers are not in a frame on a wall. They are in reports and in the literature and in the lives of people I have never met and will never meet, and whose access to care is different because of the work. And that is the only record that matters in the end, which is not the record on the wall but the record in the world. I am 32 years old. I am doing the work I knew at 19 I was going to do. The photograph is on my desk. The work continues. I want to describe the year between the ceremony and my grandmother's letter more fully than I have, because it was the year in which most of the actual change happened, and I have covered it in summary. The photograph went out in May. My mother called in May. My father called in May. These things I have described. What I have not described is what happened inside those calls, the specific and painstaking process of explaining my work to people who had been hearing about it for 5 years without understanding what they were hearing, which required not just describing the work, but understanding why the description had not worked before and correcting for the failure. The reason the description had not worked before was that I had been describing my work in the language of the work itself, which is to say in the language of epidemiology and population health and health disparities and structural factors, which is precise language and accurate language, and also language that requires a shared context to be interpretable. And my parents did not have that context, and my descriptions had assumed they did, and the assumption had been wrong. After the photograph, I stopped assuming the context and started building it, meaning I started every conversation about my work from a different starting point, which was the problem rather than the profession. I said the problem first, meaning I said what the situation was that the work was trying to improve, and I said it in terms that did not require technical knowledge to receive. I said that in certain populations, people did not go to the doctor when they should because the systems for getting to the doctor were set up in ways that made it difficult, and that my job was to find out specifically why it was difficult and specifically what could be changed, and that when the changes were made, the numbers moved in the direction that meant people were getting the care they needed. I described the 31%. My mother said 31%, and her voice had the quality of someone who has just understood a number, rather than heard it. My father said that was a significant improvement. He said it the way an engineer says something is significant, which is precisely and without decoration, and I received it as the specific and complete thing it was. The fellowship started in September of 2019, 4 months after the ceremony,
at the Community Health Organization in Detroit, where I spent 2 years before becoming epidemiology lead at the
Clinic Network. The fellowship was my first post-degree position, and it was the one I had accepted over 2 better-paying options because it was doing the specific work I had been trained to do in the specific population I had written my thesis about, and accepting it over the better-paying options was a decision I made with the same clarity I had used to choose the degree in the first place, which is to say I made it based on the work rather than the credential the work came with. I told my mother about the salary difference when she asked, and she was quiet for a moment. And then she said she thought that was the right decision. I said I knew. She said she was glad I was not going to let the money tell me what to do. This was the most direct evidence I had to that point, that my mother had understood something about how I operated that she had not been able to receive before the photograph, and I noted it and stored it, and have returned to it when I need to remember that understanding comes in increments, and that the increments arrive when they arrive and not when you schedule them. Adana called me in August of 2019, 3 months after the ceremony, to ask a public health question that had come up in a clinical rotation she was doing as part of her law degree. which required her to understand healthcare access from a legal perspective. The question was technical and specific, and I answered it over a 40-minute call during which she asked follow-up questions that were increasingly good, meaning increasingly precise and increasingly aimed at understanding the structural problem rather than the surface symptom. By the end of the call, she had a working understanding of the intersection between immigration status and healthcare access that was significantly more useful for her clinical work than the summary she had started with. She called the following week with another question, and the week after that. By October, we were talking once a week, on a schedule we had not explicitly established, but that had established itself through the pattern of calls. And by November, I was calling her as often as she was calling me. Not because I had public health questions that required a law student, but because I had been in the middle of a conversation with her the previous week and had thought of 3 things I wanted to say, and had needed a reason to call. The conversation was the reason. We talked about the work and about the family and about the specific experience of having been positioned inside a hierarchy that neither of us had chosen and that had shaped the relationship between us in ways that neither of us had examined until the wrong door opened one of them up for inspection. She said once that she thought the photograph had been the most useful thing the family system had accidentally produced. And I said I thought that was an accurate and slightly cold way to describe a moment that had also been genuinely painful. And she said she was a lawyer and that accurate and cold was her natural register and that she was still working on it. I said I could tell and that she was making progress. I want to tell you about the family group chat because it has been different since the photograph in ways that are small and measurable and that represent the most consistent form of change, available in a dispersed family with 23 members across 3 countries and 4 generations. The group chat functions as the family's primary information infrastructure, meaning it is the channel through which news travels and celebrations are acknowledged and photographs are shared, and it had, before the photograph, a specific pattern of engagement with my professional life that I want to describe accurately. When I shared milestones, meaning completions and acceptances and appointments, the responses were warm and general, the digital equivalent of the congratulations one receives from people who are glad for your success without having attended to the specific nature of what you succeeded at. After the photograph, the engagement changed in quality, meaning people began responding to things I shared with questions rather than with congratulations, and the questions indicated that they had thought about what I had shared rather than simply received it. My Aunt Chidinma, my mother's sister, sent me a message in September asking whether I had written anything about the Clinic Network's diabetes management outcomes that she could share with a colleague in Lagos, and I sent her 2 reports, and she shared them. And the colleague wrote back with a question that produced a 3-message exchange about population-level intervention design, which was the most substantive professional communication I had had in the family's information channel in 12 years of professional life. The photograph did not change the family's framework for understanding work. It made the gap in the framework's coverage visible enough that enough people became uncomfortable enough to begin filling it. That is the most accurate description I can give of what changed and how the changing happened. It happened slowly and specifically, in the way that things change when people are deciding to change them rather than being forced to. And it has continued for 5 years in the same incremental and specific way. And it is still happening. The family gathering in January of this year was the first one I had attended, where the conversation about my work occupied the same amount of time as the conversation about any other family member's work. Not more, not as a corrective, but the same, which is the only measurement of parity that actually means parity rather than compensation. My uncle Chukwudi asked me a specific question about infectious disease surveillance that had come up in something he had read, and we talked about it for 20 minutes, while the rest of the table listened and occasionally contributed. And at the end of the 20 minutes, my cousin Emeka, the software engineer, said he had been thinking about data infrastructure for population health and whether the tools used in tech had applications in the kind of work I did. And I said yes, and that the gap between the two sectors in terms of data tooling was significant and was itself a health equity problem, and he said he would like to hear more about that, and I said I would send him something. I sent him a paper the following week. He read it and replied with 3 questions. I answered them. We are still in that correspondence, 4 months later, and it is the most useful technical conversation I have had outside of my professional context in years. This is what the photograph produced. Eventually, through the family's slow and imperfect and ongoing process of updating its picture of me. Not a transformation, a shift, a real one. My supervisor at the clinic network, Dr. Katrina Wells, asked me last year how things were going with my family. I told her about the photograph and the calls and the group chat and the January gathering and my father's visits and Adana's weekly calls. She listened the way she listens in clinical conversations, which is with the sustained attention of someone building a complete picture before responding, and when I finished, she said it sounded like the photograph had been useful documentation. I said I thought that was accurate. She said she had observed over the years that people who worked in public health often had a more complicated relationship with visibility than people in other fields because the work was designed to be invisible in its successes, and the workers often were too, and that this could extend into personal life in ways that were not always beneficial. I said I thought that was also accurate, and that I had been working on being more visible in contexts where visibility served a purpose. She said she thought the graduation photograph was a case in point. I said it had not been planned as visibility. She said the best documentation rarely was. We went back to work. I thought about that conversation for several days afterward, about the relationship between the work I did professionally, which was to make the invisible visible through data, and the thing that had happened personally, which was to let a photograph do what I had not known how to do, which was to show the people in my family the gap between their picture of me and the thing in front of them. Both are forms of documentation. Both work the same way. You make the thing accurate and complete, and you let the accuracy do what accuracy does when it reaches people who are capable of receiving it. I want to say something about what it is like to work in a field whose successes are measured by the absence of things, because I have mentioned it and not described it, and the description is relevant to everything else in this story. Public health does not produce a product you can hold, or a building you can point to, or a procedure you can name. What it produces is the illness that did not spread, the outbreak that was contained before it became visible, the death that did not happen because the intervention happened first. The measure of a successful public health effort is very often that nothing happened that would have otherwise happened, which is impossible to celebrate in the way that visible achievements are celebrated, because the nothing is not present to be pointed at. This is the central professional challenge of working in my field, and it is also, I have come to understand, the central personal challenge of explaining the field to people who are not in it. When I tell my father that the clinic network reduced the late-stage cancer diagnosis rate in the population, it serves by 18% over 3 years. He can receive the number, but he cannot visualize what it represents in the way he can visualize a building he has engineered or a road he has designed. The 18% is the absence of 18% of the people who would have been diagnosed too late. It is real people whose names I do not know, and whose specific lives have been changed by a structural intervention that I helped design, and the reality of it is not visible in any form that produces the recognition that more legible work produces. What the photograph did in one specific and ironic way, was solve this problem by making my presence visible at the exact moment my absence was also visible. The photograph shows me on a stage receiving a credential for 2 years of work designed to produce absences, and it shows the absence of my family in the seats that were supposed to hold them. And the two absences in the same image made something legible that had not been legible before, which was the cost of the pattern. You cannot photograph the disease rate you reduced. You can photograph the empty seats in the third row. The photograph made the less visible thing more visible by placing it beside the more visible one, which is a public health methodology applied to a personal situation, and which I find appropriate in a way that I would find more ironic if it were not also genuinely useful. Adana asked me once in one of our weekly calls whether I thought I would have found my way to the work without the family structure pushing back against it. I thought about this for a moment, and I said I thought I would have, because the work was the answer to a question I had been carrying since I was 19, and the question did not depend on the family to produce it. She said she thought that was right, and that she had asked because she had been thinking about her own work and whether she had chosen it for itself or for the legibility. And she said she was not certain the answer was fully what she wanted it to be. I said I thought the honesty of the question was itself a good sign. She said she hoped so. We talked for another 20 minutes about her current cases and about a brief I was preparing for a state health department. And we said goodnight, and I went back to the brief, and the brief was submitted on time and produced the funding recommendation I had argued for, and the funding was awarded, and the work continues, which is how I expect it will continue to end for as long as I am doing it. There is one more thing I have not said about Adana and the wrong door, and I want to say it because it is the truest thing I know about what happened between us in the lobby after the ceremony. After we talked about where everyone was, and after she said she was sorry, and after I said I was glad she had walked through the wrong door, she said something that I did not include in the earlier telling, and that I want to include here, because the fuller account requires it. She said she was not sure it had been an accident. I asked what she meant. She said she had been thinking, since she sat down in the wrong row and looked up and found me crossing a stage, about the sequence of things that had needed to be true for her to be in that seat at that moment, which included her friend's ceremony being scheduled at the same time as mine, in an adjacent building with a similar entryway, and her being on the wrong side of the building when she was looking for the entrance, and the usher directing her to the third row, which happened to be the row with the reserved seats I had mailed tickets for 3 weeks earlier, and the university photographer pointing the camera at that row at the exact moment I crossed the stage. She said the convergence of those things was not the probability you would assign to an accident, and that she had been finding herself thinking about what the low probability meant. I told her I was a public health epidemiologist, and that my professional relationship with low probability events was to note them accurately and move on. She said that sounded like something I would say. I said it was. We walked out of the auditorium together into the May morning, me with my diploma and her with her reserved card, and neither of us said anything more about probability or accidents or the specific alignment of wrong doors and right moments. Some things are their own explanation when you have been paying the right kind of attention. And Adana had been paying the right kind of attention, since she sat down in the wrong row, and that attention was the beginning of everything that followed. If you have ever done work that no one in your family fully understood, and if you are still doing it because the work is worth doing, regardless of who is watching, and if you have ever had someone walk through the wrong door at the right moment and finally see you, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments what you are building and who finally saw it. And if this story found you at the right time, share it with someone who is still waiting to be seen. Subscribe if you have not already, and check the link in the description. There is more there. I will be here.